Fair warning before today's game, this gets a bit messy. Now, this is a blitz game between Alireza Firouzja with white and Magnus Carlsen as black. This is a banter blitz game played in the year 2020. And as these games tend to be, towards the end, there are quite a few blunders. Just to give you a heads up on that, but up to that point, it really is an interesting, compelling game, if for no other reason than the strength of the players involved. Ferrugia, I think, was around 27, 26 at this point in his career, and Carlsen was 28, 62 at the time this game was played. So still very strong chess. Again, Ferrugia has white, Carlsen has black. Let's jump right in. E4 and knight f6. Carlsen decides to play the Alekhine defense, sort of mix things up a little bit. A bit risky, but he's willing to take that chance. E5, knight d5, d4, d6. And Firouzja plays knight to f3, sort of the absolute main line. When white wants to really challenge the Alekhine's defense, they just play c4 and then f4, the four pawns variation. But black players have been able to handle this position okay over the years. Knight f3 is a little more mature, not quite as ambitious opening. Pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, g6, bishop to d3, bishop to g7, castles, castles, and rook to e1. We've got the half-open file, so the rook is placed there. Knight to d7. Black has less space, so he would love to trade off these knights. Firouzja says, I want to keep that material. I'm going to use it to take advantage of my extra space. C5. So Carlsen wants to open up that long diagonal of the bishop. You see these kind of ideas like Grunfeld defenses sometimes. So he wants to pry open that line for the bishop. C4 hits the knight, knight to b4, d5. So Firouzja's gained space, but Carlsen now does have that diagonal for the bishop. And here, Carlsen plays a sharp move. It's a novelty, b5. As he was playing the game, he felt this was a very natural move, made a lot of sense to him, and it does make sense. So bishop e4 is the response. Now the knight can't capture the bishop, and the bishop, there is some x-ray pressure on the rook at a8, but not too much. Carlsen responds with knight to f6, hitting back on the bishop. The computers say f5 hitting the bishop is a little better, but that's a very computer-esque move. It weakens a lot of squares. It's not the kind of move a human being usually plays. Knight to f6. Now a3, counterattacking the knight on b4. So Carlsen goes ahead and grabs the bishop, then pawn takes pawn. And now we have all of this tension on the queen side. These b and c pawns for both sides are hitting each other, and there's lots of tension. Knight goes back to d6, pawn takes pawn, and knight to c4. So black has some queenside pressure with the bishop and the knight at c4, hitting b2, but white has these very nice pawns on c5 and d5. And while those pawns are nice and can create a lot of trouble, they're also a bit loose. And Carlsen even mentioned that mentioned this during the game. He was not that worried about those pawns, even though they look really nice. Knight to c3, b4, knight to a4. Now, the knight, of course, is on the side of the board, and we're usually told that's not the best place for the knight. But in this case, it helps to defend b2 and the c5 pawn, so the knight is fairly well placed. Carlsen played e6. He played it fairly quickly. He says, well, if white plays d6, yes, he gets an advanced passed pawn, but all of my pieces are on good squares, and that's what happens. d6, and Carlsen plays bishop to b7. Now he has these weakened light squares, and if you look at his three minor pieces, they are all on good squares. So he's right about that. But Firouzja's got this nasty set of pawns right here, too. Now, here, Firouzja plays bishop to g5, developing with tempo, hitting the queen at d8. Now, Carlsen can see what's about to happen, and he realizes it's not that good for him. But his big mistake here, even though he realizes that what Firouzja is about to do, is he takes too much time. As I mentioned in the introduction, this was a 3-minute game for each side, and Magnus spent almost 50 seconds on this move. I mean, almost an entire third of his time. But he saw what was going to happen. He probably should have just plumped in anyway. But apparently the move queen to d7, a computer recommendation, was a safer option, but it was passive. So Carlsen plays bishop to f3, and he knew what was coming. Firouzja does not retake the bishop, which of course would just cost him the bishop on g5. He would just lose a piece. But instead, he plays the move queen to c1, defending the bishop at g5, counterattacking the knight at c4. And of course, the bishop at f3 is also still under attack from the g2 pawn. White is better. f6, pawn takes bishop. And here, instead of just taking the bishop right away, he decides to play knight takes d6. If he just takes the bishop, then after queen c4, white's just winning. He's got these pawns, which are now well defended. Pressure against the queen, the rook centralized, that's it. So instead, he takes the pawn on d6 with the knight. You know, if you're going to lose a piece, you might as well get as much for it as you can. So not only does he take the pawn, but he uglies up that nice pawn structure that Firouzja had. So pawn takes, rook to e6, rook to c8. Now queen to d1. Computers like to move queen to e3. The idea being not only does it support the rook, but it supports a knight move to c5. That's a very important square for that knight. If the knight can get there, it's quite strong. But they're both beginning to get low on time at this point. Queen to d1 to support the pawn. Queen to a5. Again, computers like king to h8. They think the computer thinks the king is just too vulnerable on g8. Queen to a5 is the move played by Carlsen. Queen to b3, threatening a discovered check. If this rook were to move, it would be check to the king. So now the king has to move. Rook to d1, the rooks belong behind passed pawns. We know that, whether it's your pawn or your opponent's. Queen to f5, d7, rook c to d8, and queen to d5. White is willing to trade queens because the pawn is just too powerful in the endgame. So he'd be happy to trade queens, and Magnus isn't going to do that, so he keeps queens on the board. Queen e4, queen c7, queen to c6. Now he goes ahead and exchanges queens. Queen takes, rook c6, bishop f6, b3. He wants to get this pawn at b2 off of a dark square so the bishop cannot capture it. Bishop goes to e7, and these moves are played blindingly fast. As I said, things get messy. The most amazing thing is how accurate their moves are with just a few seconds left on the clock. Firouzja has about 10 more seconds. It's sort of 23 seconds for Firouzja and about 10 seconds or so for Carlsen. Rook to e6, rook to f7 to defend the bishop. Rook to d5. Computers like this move. Humans wouldn't see it, of course, but knight to b2 with the idea of knight c4 and knight to e5, hitting the rook and protecting the pawn. Rook to d5, king to g7, rook a6, bishop to f8, rook f3 was probably, he could go ahead and take the pawn and be okay with that. Bishop to f8, rook takes pawn, king to f6, and this gives the Firouzja the advantage back. Carlsen had fought to a fairly equal position. If instead here he takes on f3, Carlsen was doing okay. But now after the move king to f6, Magnus has 11 seconds, and Firouzja has 21 seconds. Rook to a6 check, king to b6, king to g7, knight to b6, an important move. Not only does he defend the pawn on d7, he also sets up rook to a8, trading off a pair of rooks and getting rid of the one piece that's blockading on the d8 square, a strong move. Rook to f6, rook to a8, to exchange those rooks, bishop to e7. He wants to maintain a blockading piece on that square. Rook takes, bishop takes, knight to c8. What Firouzja wants to do is play the knight to d6 and then to b7 to challenge the bishop on d8 and control that queening square. Rook to c6. Now at this point, these moves are being played at almost pre-move speed. These are instantaneous moves. I mean, like, they're not even thinking. Rook to d3. Now here, he could just go ahead and play knight to d6, because if rook to c7, knight to e8 check, forking the king and the rook would have won. So knight to d6, continuing the plan, actually would have worked here. He plays the rook back to d3, rook to c1 check, rook to c3, challenging the rook. He doesn't want to take, obviously, because then the pawn would advance. Rook to d4, rook b3, now knight to d6. He continues the plan of playing the knight to b7 to challenge the bishop at d8. Rook to c3. And as I said, these moves are being played instantaneously. The move that Carlsen would have made if he had had time to think was rook to a3. That way, this rook can come back and defend the bishop at d8, something like knight to b7, rook to a8. And here black is actually holding in the position. But instead he plays the rook to c3. And now this square is controlled by the pawn and the rook cannot get back. Knight b7, bishop f6, queen, boom, boom, b3, knight e6, king f6. And again, they're just spamming these moves instantaneously. So there are a number of mistakes. For example, here, Firouzja actually hangs his knight, but Carlsen had maybe 1.5 seconds, so Firouzja would have won on time. He had about 10 seconds. Either way, but just king e5, rook e4, king d6, knight to b5 check, takes, and knight c3. And Carlsen ran out of time. Of course, he's lost in this position. So although it became a mess at the end, leading up to that point was some really innovative and creative chess and really, really impressive stuff. And I think a relevant game, if for no other reason, the quality and level of the players. I hope you enjoyed it. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.